Everybody talks about insulin resistance and just how bad it is, but that's not enough. It's good to identify the problem, but what's the answer? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. We're going to talk about that today. On last Friday's edition of Beat Diabetes, I shared some extremely important information about insulin resistance from the book Why We Get Sick by scientist and researcher Benjamin Bikman. Bikman has spent an enormous amount of time studying the phenomenon of insulin resistance, and his book on this subject is one of the best I've read. I shared last week that Bikman believes that insulin resistance is not only the root of type 2 diabetes, but is also likely to be either the cause or one of the major contributing factors to many other physical diseases and afflictions, including heart disease, high blood pressure, infections, cancer, Alzheimer's, and numerous others. His conclusion after all his research is that while insulin is certainly necessary to maintain good health and keep glucose levels in a normal range, when insulin levels become highly elevated and stay that way for years, a condition known as hyperinsulinemia, the results are absolutely disastrous. Ben's conclusion is that the number one major reason for insulin resistance is high levels of insulin that result from eating way too many carbs and sugars. He does list a number of secondary and lesser factors that can also promote insulin resistance, which include sedentary living, constant inflammation, stress, and obesity. But while this may be true, in my opinion, our diet far outweighs all of these put together 10 times over. And if you do not get your diet right, it will hardly matter if you lose weight, work out at the gym every day, and sit on a mountain somewhere singing Kumbaya to yourself over and over again. If you still eat those donuts and pretzels and mac and cheese dinners, and eat cake and ice cream, and then wash it all down with a supersized Coca-Cola, none of those other things are going to matter. Your horrible diet will outweigh all the other factors, and you will struggle with and be defeated by diabetes, especially once you pass middle age. Dr. Bikman's book is divided into 3 sections, which deal with the nature of insulin resistance, the causes of insulin resistance, and the solution for insulin resistance. Since we talked mostly on our last video about sections 1 and 2, today we'll focus on the cure. Ben lists 2 major aspects of reversing insulin resistance, which are exercise and diet. Now, I know that sounds a lot like you might hear from many mainstream nutritionists. We must exercise and eat a healthy diet. But there's a big difference between what they mean and what he means, especially when it comes to the area of diet. First, Bikman acknowledges that diet is by far the heavy lifter when it comes to reversing insulin resistance. But he does acknowledge that exercise, or to put it simpler, movement, is of value against diabetes and insulin resistance. He writes, "Any kind of physical activity can help to combat insulin resistance because it removes glucose from the blood without involving insulin." Many of you have left comments saying that when your glucose rises too high, you go for a walk and find that your blood sugar levels drop fairly steadily as you walk and are significantly lower afterwards. I've heard this so often I know it must be true, but I have to be honest, I've never noticed this in any significant way in my own life. Plus, I don't have time to go for a half-hour walk after every meal. I'd rather simply cut my carbs at that meal a bit lower so that I don't have to go for a walk. But I do try to exercise most days in the mornings on my elliptical trainer, and it does seem that when I do it regularly, my fasting glucose is a bit lower, and when I'm busy and skip it for a week, my fasting glucose is higher. Ben writes, "In one study, just 16 weeks of regular exercise not only improved strength by almost 50% in men, but also increased their insulin sensitivity by over 20%. This was in the absence of any changes in diet. They just started exercising." Now, a 20% improvement of insulin sensitivity means a 20% decrease of insulin resistance, and that is nothing to sneeze at. I would say that for those who are passionate about getting their glucose levels as low as they reasonably can and reversing their insulin resistance as much as they possibly can, they would be wise to be doing some kind of exercise. And the good thing about this is that almost any kind of movement is beneficial. You don't have to be running wind sprints for hours or huffing and puffing and sweating yourself to exhaustion just to gain some benefit. A simple walk, some regular push-ups, riding a bicycle, swimming, whatever you like. Almost anything, aerobic or anaerobic or both, will help. Now let's get to the heart of what Dr. Bikman says about the solution to insulin resistance, and that is diet. The longest chapter and clearly the most important part of his book is devoted to the diet and dietary practices that effectively reverse and put an end to insulin resistance. He starts out by declaring that when it comes to the diet that most effectively promotes health and freedom from disease, our whole world got it wrong for many years. He says we collectively learned to vilify dietary fat as the leading cause of heart disease, weight gain, and diabetes. He insists that the emphasis on limiting calories to lose weight and defeat disease was also wrong. He shares a study where the participants were given 800 calories a day. Of course, they did lose a lot of weight by the end of that study, and yet he says this state of weight loss caused over half of the study subjects to develop insulin resistance to the point of type 2 diabetes. In fact, with severe calorie restriction, the body can become demonstrably insulin resistant in just a few days. So, just starving yourself until you get skinny is not the answer to defeating insulin resistance. You might just make it worse. So, what is the answer? Bikman lists 4 basic dietary rules that are the most effective practices one can do to reverse insulin resistance and consequently diabetes, if your insulin resistance has gone that far. The first rule is something I preach in all my videos, and that is to control carbohydrates. He writes, once we appreciate that too much insulin is a main driver of insulin resistance, the chain of events suggesting a solution is too obvious. Eating fewer carbohydrates equals reduced blood glucose, which equals reduced blood insulin, which equals improved insulin sensitivity. He tells how that protein can produce a mild insulin rise, carbohydrates can produce a huge insulin rise, and dietary fat elicits no insulin effect at all. Then he says, thus a diet that limits the insulin spiker, carbohydrates, especially refined, and increases the insulin dampeners, protein and fat, especially unrefined, is one that should improve insulin sensitivity, and as we will see, it does. Yes, it does. Reduce your glucose spikes and you reduce your insulin spikes, which means much lower insulin levels in your bloodstream throughout the day. Make this a rule of your life with day after day and year after year of markedly lower levels of glucose and insulin, and you will be the healthier for it. Diabetes will retreat, high blood pressure will drop, and you'll even lessen your chances of heart disease and cancer. Bikman tells how that doctors and nutritionists knew this as early as the 1800s. But with the emergence and popularity of Ancel Keys in the 1950s and 60s, who was convinced that all fat was bad and all carbs were good, somehow what people had known for a long time was pushed aside in favor of this cool and sophisticated new concept. The notorious food pyramid was born, which told us we could eat all the chips and the bread and the pretzels we wanted, and we should eat them. But we must make sure and avoid fatty meats, nuts, avocados, and eggs. And we soon fell in line, and diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and high blood pressure exploded. Bikman writes, this change was supposed to make us healthier. But the explosion of insulin resistance during this time is evidence that our modern dietary shift away from fat in favor of carbohydrates has not yielded the intended results. And I would say that is putting it mildly. I would go further and say that this emphasis on making carbs and starches the bulk of our diets, with no restriction on sugar, has been a total disaster. Innumerable people have suffered heart attacks, struggled with diabetes, fought unsuccessfully with obesity, battled with high blood pressure, and died decades before their time because of this unscientific, irrational, unproven experiment, which is proving to be the greatest hoax of the 20th century and has continued in many quarters even until now. A second rule of Ben Bikman's approach to diet is to prioritize protein. Many keto dieters aren't too comfortable with protein. They know carbs must be low and they're told that fats must be high, but what do you do with protein? Many are just plain uncomfortable with the idea of eating too much protein. They've been told it does raise insulin levels and glucose, so in their minds we can have a little, but not too much. So go easy on the meat and eggs. Ben Bikman doesn't quite see it this way. He writes, avoid the temptation to eat too little protein. While certain amino acids can cause an insulin release, the degree to which this occurs depends heavily on the amount of glucose in the blood. If carbohydrate consumption and blood glucose are low, there will be little or no insulin response to dietary protein. In other words, if you keep your carbs strictly limited, you can eat meat and eggs with very little glucose or insulin rise. Now, I can't say much about the insulin levels. I can't test those, but I have never noticed any kind of significant glucose spike after eating meat. Almost none at all. And I have to say that we're still learning about the ideal diet and the ideal macros for diabetics. I've never feared protein, and being able to eat meat freely gives me tastier and more filling meals. And that's one reason I never calculate the percentage of fat in my meals, trying to hit that magic 70% level that many keto experts say we should have. As long as Mike the Meter is satisfied that I'm not spiking my glucose, I'm happy, and I figure my pancreas realizes there's no need to release a huge flood of insulin. A third dietary rule of Benjamin Bikman is to fill with fat. Even though we shouldn't fear protein, neither should we fear fat. As long as we keep our carbs low, fat is our friend and not our adversary. Bikman writes, remember that the fat we eat does not increase insulin and is thus a useful food that can nourish your body while not feeding the beast, insulin resistance. In fact, be wary of meals that don't include fat. They won't be as satisfying, and the insulin effect of the meal will very likely be higher than it would otherwise be. All the things that people used to enjoy, cream, cheese, butter, ghee, olive oil, nuts, and the like, and then we were told to avoid them at all costs, well, it turns out that they're good for us after all, as long as we do not stuff ourselves with lots of carbohydrates along with them, which is precisely what the standard American diet involves. So the moral is avoid most carbs, but don't worry about the low-carb vegetables, and enjoy the fat. The fourth and final dietary rule Benjamin Bikman espouses is watch the clock. And by this he means, well, you guessed it, time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting. He writes, having prolonged periods during the day where glucose and insulin are low is a vital step in the right direction. And the best way to have a prolonged period of low insulin and low glucose is to have a prolonged period where you just simply do not eat. This doesn't mean you have to go on a days-long fast. Bikman recommends mixing it up with some days where we eat 3 meals a day, some days where we narrow that window of eating to 6 hours or so and eat 2 meals, and some days where we eat 1 meal a day, and no snacks. This, of course, is not news to many of us, but it is nice to have a scientist and a researcher confirm through studies and research what we've experienced in our own lives and through our own little glucose meters. The idea of grazing like a cow all day long, and especially grazing on high-carb foods, is the surest, easiest, fastest way to become diabetic in a very short time. And conversely, limiting your daily window of eating, and then eating low-carb meals when you do have meals, and eating no snacks in between, is the surest, easiest, and fastest way to reverse your diabetes, reverse your insulin resistance, and get that A1C down to a normal and beautiful level. So, in review, Ben says that the 4 dietary keys to reversing insulin resistance are 1. Control carbohydrates, 2. Prioritize protein, 3. Fill with fat, and 4. Watch the clock In other words, time-restricted eating. And as evidence, he shares a recent experience he had in his own lab. He worked with a local clinic and encouraged 11 volunteers, all ladies with type 2 diabetes, to follow these protocols for 90 days. He writes this, "With no changes in exercise, no counting calories, and remarkably without the use of any medications, the type 2 diabetes was gone." Now, I realize that this by itself is perhaps not enough to satisfy all the skeptics, but 11 diabetic ladies who lost their diabetes in 3 months by following these simple dietary rules? Well, that ain't too bad. The book I've been sharing from is Why We Get Sick by Benjamin Bikman, and it is available on Amazon. That's it for now. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up so YouTube will promote it to other diabetics seeking answers. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click on that bell icon so you'll be notified every time we post new videos. God bless. See you again soon.